yours.
Great. Thank you, Sandra. So let me say good afternoon and welcome to everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you again to our Voices in Clinical and Translational Science series, which you know is sponsored by the Integrated Translational Health Research Institute of Virginia, or iTHRIV. I'll just remind you briefly, the mission of iTHRIV is to catalyze and sustain inclusive clinical and translational research through diverse collaborative team science, innovative data science, and broad workforce development in order to improve human health and promote health equity. This series serves as a platform to lift outstanding researchers and underrepresented voices in research across the iTHRIV partnership with a focus on promoting dialogue and encouraging team science. The series is aimed at amplifying diverse perspectives in clinical and translational research to foster innovation in an inclusive environment. The series highlights our outstanding iTHRIV researchers who will share their research and share their lived experience with us. So it is my great pleasure today to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Kemi Bankole. Dr. Bankole is a geriatric psychiatrist at Carilion Clinic. She's an associate professor of psychiatry and internal medicine and the chief diversity officer at Virginia Tech Carilion School of Medicine. She earned her medical degree from the University of Ibadan in College of Medicine in Nigeria and did her internship in Dorset County Hospital prior to her psychiatry residency in the UK. She came to the US for another psychiatry residency at SUNY Downstate in Brooklyn, New York, and did a geriatric psychiatry fellowship at North Shore, Long Island Jewish Hospital. So today, Dr. Bankole is going to share with us some of her research and her lived experience in her talk entitled Sprints and Marathons, the Realities of Clinical Research. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bankole. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Bankole.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for that wonderful introduction. And I'm going to share my screen. Oh, actually, I can't share it.
You can now. Go ahead.
Okay. All right, I can share it now. And here we go. And I, first of all, want to start off by thanking the iTHRIV partnership for giving me this opportunity to present my experience as a clinical researcher. And also I want to thank them for the part that they've actually played in this journey so far. All right. So first of all, I want to start by saying that I have no conflicts to declare. And these are my objectives for this hour. So sort of defining clinical research, clinical translational research, and providing a roadmap, not the roadmap, a roadmap, mine for research as a working clinician, and also to provide real-world suggestions and recommendations as to what we can do individually, but also what we can do institutionally as well. Right. So I always like to start off my talks with like definitions so I know everyone's on the same page. I usually use the example of when I moved to Virginia after my fellowship and I'd ask my patients if they felt anxious. And, I'd get some puzzling looks. And then over time, I realized that if I said if they felt nervous, they understood me immediately. So I understand the importance of everyone being on the same page. So according to Department of Health and Human Services, they define clinical research as systematic investigation. So, and that investigation includes the development of what we're doing, of the design, the testing, and all of that, the point of that research is to contribute to generalizable knowledge. And the FDA simply says is anything that involves people, either as patients or healthy volunteers. Okay. Now, clinical translational research, it's sort of a continuum, looking at what our partners and colleagues in basic science research, what they're doing and how we can translate that into medical care from basically bench to bedside. And that effective translation can really help to introduce new approaches for prevention, diagnosis, and treatments of diseases. I often use the development of the Pittsburgh B compound as an example. Now, Pittsburgh B compound was the first compound that was actually used to label amyloid in Alzheimer's patients on PET scans. And it took many years to get to the point where Pittsburgh B was effective. Now, when they found that that was going to be the effective molecule. But the problem with Pittsburgh B is that you can't just take that straight from, sort of that research into clinical practice because it has such a short half-life. I mean, I don't know anyone who gets in and is checked in, and by the time you get in for your CT scan or your PET scan, it's 15 minutes later. There's so much that goes on. So we've actually had to develop new molecules that will actually work in clinical practice. So I see this so often where, people, it's like a mantra. It's not a marathon, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. But then I also found that someone says, remember, it's a sprint, not a marathon. But I would like to posit that when it comes to clinical research, it's actually both. So I am going to use the analogy of a road trip to describe my experience as a clinical researcher. All right, so you're going to see a lot of road trip and road signs as we progress in this journey. So let's start. My research journey started when I was a second-year psychiatry resident, but the preparation for that actually started a bit earlier than that. So in my first year, towards the end of my first year as a psychiatry resident at SUNY Downstate Medical Center in Brooklyn, I set up a meeting with my program director to talk to her about my interest in geriatric psychiatrists. And the way I was coming to this was really more of a clinical sort of aspect, like what should I do, what's next. I wasn't thinking of research at all. And what she did was she advised me to meet with Dr. Cohen. And Dr. Carl Cohen, he's a SUNY Distinguished Service Professor, and he had this schizophrenia research group. He'd done a lot of work with schizophrenia in older adults. So I met with him, and I was invited to join this schizophrenia research group, which was made up of residents from all different resident years and who had either interest in geriatric psychiatry or had interest in research. And what we had and what that group provided us was mentorship. Mentorship, not just from Dr. Cohen, but from our senior residents as well, and from the fellows that were that took part in research. And we learned things like the IRB process. I will never forget when one of my senior residents just went on and on about how onerous the IRB process. And that was the first time I heard about that. And so there was a lot of learning, a lot of data analysis, research paper submission, review process. And the residents from this group have gone on to do so many great things nationally. And we have positions here. Actually, there are two of us managed to end up at VTCSOM. And we have, like I said, all over the country leading groups in both geriatric psychiatry and in research as well. So part of the things that I was able to accomplish and do in residency was become, part of the American Association for Geriatric Psychiatry, because I'd voiced that interest. And then this area of research opened. And you have the Stepping Stones program, which was a program for residents who with interest in geriatric psychiatry, and you'd be provided with mentorship and also access to the annual programs. And in recent years, that sort of transitioned to the AAGP Scholars Program. And we provide the medical students, residents with mentorship. There's a project that they're supposed to do at the end of the year. So sort of building, so one of the things I gained from this was another sort of framework for support as I was going through residency. And so what are the outcomes? So by the time I joined, I think it was 2005, late 2005, early 2006 that I joined the schizophrenia research group. And we were able to publish my first paper in a peer-reviewed journal. That was done in 2007, and I was the second author on that paper. My first author paper was published in 2008 towards the end of my residency, my final year of residency. And that was the factors affecting quality of life in a multiracial sample of older persons with schizophrenia. And throughout that time, we were able to publish 5 more papers. So that means I had 7 peer-reviewed publications where I was one of the authors. We were able to present at several international and national professional organizations. We had lots of program poster presentations. And in 2008, I won the AAGP Member in Training Research Award for the work that I had done with this research group. Right. So this was a really productive time for me. I had several years. I had lots of mentors. And I had lots of experience with folks that were outside of my institution. So this was like a wonderful sort of experience as a budding researcher. So for me, residency was a sprint. It was like you were just doing it. And it was every Monday at 5 p.m. for like 2 hours, we were doing this work. So it took time, and you needed to make sure that you were that you were committed to this. So then we move on to the fellowship. So my 5th year, PGY 5. And one of the things I learned with fellowship, it was a really very clinically busy time for me. And based on what I had learned as a resident and the time it takes to get projects up and running, or even to join an ongoing project, I realized that it was very unlikely that I would be able to start and complete something in its entirety within that 1 year. And especially based on the fact that I wasn't going to be staying within that, at LIJ post-fellowship. Now, there are some fellowship programs in geriatrics where it's 2 years, and research is as part of that. So and that's usually for psychiatry residents who are going to do more have more of a research career than a clinical career. And I really liked working with my patients, so I wanted more of that clinical career. So fellowship was basically, I was on the blocks. I was just resting at that point in time and sort of building up the things that I would need for to be able to practice as a geriatric psychiatrist. So the road trip continues. And we'll talk about what life was like as a junior faculty, and also how Bessie sort of changed my clinical research career. So as a junior faculty, you have to know understand the realities of life as an attending. Clinical work comes first. It's like the #1 thing. That's why they hired you. Research, that's extra. So it takes, you need to make sure that you have that time, but also the will to do that part of research. And one of the things I've learned over time is that research doesn't need to be huge, NIH or whatever multi-million funded study. It can be something as asking a simple question within your clinical realm and figuring out what's the best way to answer that question. Right. So, like I said, if research is important to you, you need to be ready to say yes when opportunities come your way. Collaboration is key. And when I started at the Center for Healthy Aging, there was already a collaborative group that was working with between the Center for Healthy Aging, the Industrial and Systems Engineering at Virginia Tech, and engineering at UVA. So I joined this group. I was like, yeah, I'm interested. I've done some research. Let's see what I can do now. And what happened was that, we're looking for local funding sources because research costs, your time costs a lot. And thinking about the equipment, should you need that requires funding as well. So we looked for local sources. And then that was around the time the Carilion Clinic started its research acceleration project grant. And in 2010, we won $15,000 to do a pilot program on agitation in dementia. All right, so junior faculty, there's still some sprints, but I really learned that I had to maintain a pace. If I stopped, it was more and more difficult to start again. But because I was able to join in with something that was already ongoing and be a part of that and see what the team was like, I was able to maintain that pace. All right. So we completed this pilot project, and it was entitled Validation of Wearable Motion Sensor Technology in Agitation of Dementia. So that was the REP grant, and I was actually the PI for this pilot project. So our collaborators mentioned, and I worked with other collaborators as well, Virginia Tech, what was then Virginia Tech Carilion Research Institute, which is now the Carilion Biomedical Research Institute. And in this, I had patients who had, geriatric psychiatrists, patients with different types of dementias, and I worked with our neuroscientist, Dr. Moran at FBRI, back then VTCRI, on assessing frontal lobe medial temporal lobe connectivity in Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. And that had a local funding source from Virginia Tech, and we worked on that for 4 years. So I was able to make these connections, again, collaboration. None of these would have been possible by myself. It's important to know. Okay. So outcomes. So again, one of the other things I did is I sort of made attempts to mirror my mentorship experience. It was not adequate, but it was something. So I worked with residents, we did some case reports, and we were able to do work on non-funded research where they were actually able to present at national organizations as well. And with the RAP grant, we're able to publish a paper on the validation of non-invasive body sensor networks. I presented at an engineering conference. I think I was one of the very few clinicians at that conference. So I had lots of questions that that the engineers asked. It was very interesting. It was a very interesting experience. So I had that, and then what we did is sort of like, oh, we're stepping up. We talked about using that pilot study as a and using that study as a pilot for a bigger grant, an NIH grant. I was like, whoa, that's fancy. We're not doing anything small anymore. So we worked on an NIH proposal, and I was the PI on that one. It was submitted in 2010, and we then entitled that, had the same title, and it wasn't funded. And as I was reading through all the, the critique, the one that stood out to me was this: PI needs more experience. That was hurtful, but also true, because I knew I needed more experience, right? And so we went back to the drawing board, and we still met. And again, we're talking about people from 3 different institutions: Virginia Tech, UVA, Carilion Clinic. And that was before the medical school officially became, a college at Virginia Tech. We're still, we're still doing the partnership. So stepping up was like, can I really do this at this point? Rejection can be discouraging, but it's an important part of clinical research. It's an important part of research. Having one isn't, it shouldn't just stop you. You need to continue going on. And that was one of the things that I learned working with my collaborators. I was like, yeah, that happens. Let's move on. What's the next thing to do? So you have to continue stepping up. So then what we then did was we worked on the proposal and submitted one to the National Science Foundation. And this is where I say Bessie changed my clinical research career. And Bessie stands for Behavioral and Environmental Sensing and Intervention for Dementia Caregiver Empowerment. So we submitted this in 2013. I remember we got the rejection letter back in 2010. So for 3 years, we're working on this submission, meeting, spending whole afternoons brainstorming on what our methods, what our objectives were going to be. Again, taking time. This is extra time. and out of my clinical practice, but it's something I felt like would be, if we were able to get this done, would be really helpful for my patients. And we were funded. We were awarded $2.1 million, and the clinical team at Carilion, we got more than $1 million of those funds itself. And we worked on Bessie for 6 years, 2014 to 2020. It was actually a 4-year proposal, but we were able to have no cost extensions to make extend it to for 6 years. So Bessie, again, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary teamwork. So we had geriatric specialists, geriatric psychiatry and geriatric nursing. We had from Virginia Carilion School of Medicine. We also had electrical and computer engineers from the University of Virginia. And by this time, our systems and industrial engineers lead had moved to North Carolina A&T, which is an HBCU, a historically Black college in North Carolina. So we had a really diverse group of folks. We had a lot of learners, folks that were undergrad and postgrad. It was a really lovely mix. And over time, you would see students, their interest and the work that they were doing. And I also had medical students that I worked with on this study as well. And so shortly, I'll just describe what Bessie was. So Bessie is a combination of a sensor system and data analysis. So the sensor system included body-worn inertial sensors, and then we had in-home sensors that measured acoustics, light, temperature, and motion. And then the data analysis techniques would develop that to detect and assess agitation and the environmental context from the sensors. So that was Bessie. It was very complex. The engineers knew. So the conceptual model that we used were that we knew that the interaction between the caregiver and the person with dementia, as well as the person with dementia and their environment, could precipitate or affect agitation. And what we did was we used Bessie to monitor these events and then train the system to predict potential agitation, possible agitation, and also then provide just-in-time warnings for these agitation episodes. The goal was to provide, with regards to research, consistency in the data collection that used wearable technology, and to further development of evidence-based treatments and interventions. The thing is, if we're able to catch agitation in persons with dementia in the early stages before it escalates, your behavioral interventions were more liable to work. And so that reduces the risk of having patients on medications, and more significantly, the risk of them being transitioning from living at home in the community to being in a long-term care facility setting, right? So it was really important. So it was two-pronged, was so like ensuring that the engineering and the technology part of that works, but also marrying that with the clinical importance of that work, right? So there was always a lot of back and forth between the clinical team and the engineering team. We talk about what was possible, what was helpful, even if it was possible, would that be helpful? And so that dialogue was really helped shape the system that we developed eventually. All right, and we used a phased approach. So we had 3 phases. First one, we're developing and testing. If you think back to the HHS criteria, talked about the development, the testing, and planning, and all of that is part of clinical research. So we're able to do that. And then we, the other part was that the caregivers were actually also part of the study, and they helped us with usability testing. I mean, is this thing usable? If we develop it, well, is it usable for our caregivers? Is it helpful? And in the second phase, we're looking at identifying those pre-agitation states, in quotes, and then developing the manualized care for caregiver intervention. So not only detecting, but also providing behavioral interventions that were really specific for that caregiver person with dementia dyad. And then in phase 3, we developed the full system. We provided real-time caregiver notifications We provided the behavioral interventions with based on manualized care. So it was the full system. So what did we do? So we're able to publish 5 papers in peer-reviewed journals, including one that was authored by a VTCSOM student I was mentoring. She has gone on to, she went on after graduating from us to complete a neurology residency at Vanderbilt University, and she's currently doing a fellowship as a movement disorders fellowship there. So that was really wonderful to work with a student throughout. I think it was almost throughout, I think, over 4 years of medical school while she was here with us. It's the paper that we published on our phase 1 and phase 2 results. And this is the paper that Dr. Sauerbier published with us, was assessing BESI mobile application usability for caregivers of persons with dementia. Again, usability was a really key part of what we're doing. And the other thing, we were also able to present at conferences, both nationally and internationally. And we had posters, and this was a lot of sort of work, but also a lot of results and outcomes, not just for the PIs at the different institutions, but also for our students that we were working with as well. All right. So again, we talked about working with non-funded research with psychiatry residents. I had the VTCRI collaboration. We're able to, again, get publications published in peer-reviewed journals, posters, and presentations at national meetings. All right, and there was actually one meeting where I was actually able to present both BESI and the lateralization frontal lobe connectivity in that same conference. They accepted both of my proposals. So what about when research doesn't work out? So we talked about it's like a real spot. I mean, I had one point where they, NIH said, no, you need more experience. But then, we're moving on. And then it was the validating the digital Virginia Tech Carilion cognitive exam, which was a unique tool for cognitive assessment, which was going to be web-based. It was going to be, rather than pen and paper, which most of our cognitive tests are. And again, it was in collaboration with partners of Virginia Tech. We had a Carilion Clinic proof of concept fund. And again, I was ready to provide mentorship for a new VTCSOM student. So everything looked to be, looked to be good. But then there was an issue with regards to conflict of interest. And it's something, because I'd worked with public institutions where everything was your ideas came with, were sort of shared in the public interest. In this case, because there was a private interest, and that was the first time I actually had to deal with that. So it was a conflict of interest issue, and we couldn't move forward with the study. So if you look at clinicaltrials.gov, this is what it says about this study, and it has my name on it. All right. Study did not receive IRB approval and was withdrawn by the PI. I was like, yeah, we just couldn't move forward with it. So there's a lot of things so it's not just, it's not just funding, it's not just time, ethics really plays a huge part in clinical research. And this reminded me of that. I have not forgotten this. All right, so what about the downstream effects? So what happens is then, as you build up your clinical research body of work, you have something that supports both new and future endeavors. You have increasing recognition as an expert. And because of the work I've done with the NSF, I was asked to be a grant reviewer for other grant proposal by the NSF, both related to the humans that are using the system, and also with the systems, the technological systems as well. Been invited to provide lectures and papers on topics of expertise. And then all of a sudden that PI needs more experience is no longer an issue, because I didn't stop at that point. I just continued going, right? And that's a really important part of research. Like, you just can't stop. You have to continue going. right? So what's happening post-Bessie? Right. So we were able to do an add-on study after Bessie called CANIS, which stands for, which is a short for Implementing a Caregiver Personalized Automated Non-Pharmacological Intervention System for Dementia-Associated Agitation. And this was funded by, submitted a proposal to iTHRIV, the Alzheimer's and Related Disease Research Award Fund, and we were funded almost $45,000 to complete this study over a year, 2019 to 2020. And again, I served as the PI on this particular study. And with CANIS, we're able to get another paper published in a peer-reviewed journal, and we had lots of presentations. Now, with Bessie, we had, as a team, we had discussed phase 3 results, talked about which ways that we would take, we could talk about the results that we had, and we did make that data publicly available as well. But we didn't fully analyze the data. And at this time, people were moving away. So, I mean, we had one student who had been with us at UVA for the entirety of the Bessie project. And by the time we were done, he completed his PhD and he went back to his home country as a professor there. So it was like, it was getting more and more difficult to sort of keep that up. So it was really easy for me to sort of put that aside. And then I had a new administrative role, which took up a whole lot of my time because it was a sort of learning about new things, sort of the functioning of the medical school. And I talked about the role changes with my research collaborators. So Bessie wasn't really a priority at this point in time. And then the next thing that happened, I was like sort of meandering going on at this point in time. I was, again, just sort of jogging in place, no longer sprinting. The marathon was like, maybe I was just like at the side, drinking some water. And then iTHRIV. So I had some new opportunities with iTHRIV. So Voices in Clinical Translation Science. And Dr. Tressman apparently recommended me to present. And then that's when I met Sandra. And when I went through, I was like, I'm not doing this research really right now. I don't have anything to discuss. But meeting with Sandra helped turn that no, because I'd gone into that meeting with, I don't think I'm the right person for this at this point in time. And she turned that no to a not yet. And this is what she did. She introduced me to Dr. Alexandra Hatland, who's the director of the Virginia Tech Center for Biostatics and Health Data Science. Like I said, we had the data for Bessie phase 3, we just hadn't analyzed it yet. And so what we did, I met with Dr. Hatland and her team. We applied for the Virginia Tech College of Science Dean's Discovery Fund earlier this year. However, we didn't get funded for that. Again, you have starts and stops, but it was the first time in, I think, over a year where I actually felt like there was something possible to move this to, to the next stage. I discussed with my previous collaborators, some people had retired as well. And it was like, this is one of the reasons why we made sure, and even in our NSF proposal, we mentioned that we were going to make the data publicly available. So picking up the pace now. So then we applied for the Virginia Tech Academy of Science Data Science Discovery Fund. And we received notice in August 2022 that we were funded $20,000 to, specifically for, Dr. Hanlon's team to be able to analyze the data, because it's a lot of data. One of the things that we did with Bessie was that it was continuous monitoring. So in phase 1, we had continuous monitoring for 7 days. In phase 2, we had continuous monitoring for 30 days. And in phase 3, it was 60 days. So we're measuring, we had continuous data for light, for acoustics, for motion sensors for 30 days. We had data on agitation and mood for 30 days. So it was a lot of data that was involved, right? And right now, the analysis is ongoing, and we're moving towards the point where we're going to be discussing what the data is showing. So I'm really excited about that, right? And then what comes next? All right, what's next? So we're picking up the pace, we're moving on. And right now I'm exploring new areas of research. I'm doing some work collaborating with Dr. Annalisa Dubrow at UVA, who's an attending neurologist there, who has been doing some work on area deprivation index. And what we're looking to see is whether the area deprivation index influences dementia workup and diagnosis in the state of Virginia. And the reason why they want to expand from Charlottesville is that is a particular area, but we want to see what's happening within the whole state of Virginia. So we'll be joining in this partnership and working with her team. And then we're doing some health equity research. So this past year, VTCSOM established a chapter of the Equitas Health Honor Society, which focuses on health equity research and promoting health equity within the medical school, but also within the faculty as well. And part of it is for our students that are inducted into the society is that they work on a research project over their fourth year on a research project that promotes health equity or looks into health inequities. And the title of the project that we're doing is Lost in Translation, an assessment of interpreter service in a high volume inpatient unit. And I'm looking at, again, with me becoming more involved with the medical school, I'm looking at more educational research, looking at outcomes within our short history of our school. I'm looking at non-academic outcomes and looking at academic outcomes, and also doing some research on policies as well. So again, branching out from sort of clinical research, doing some educational research. And I'm new to this, but I'm really excited to learn more about it. So my recommendations: be present, ask questions. I will say mentorship is key. I do not think that I will be where I am right now without those initial building blocks and the foundation that I had working with Dr. Cohen's team as a resident. And it helps to understand the research process, sort of figuring out what's your question? Who do you need to go to ask questions? And then make time. As a clinical researcher, the research part is not your primary work. Again, it's extra. The good thing about getting the NSF grant was that it did pay for my time. So then I had more time to be able to do that. But you have to build up to the point where you are able to get that. Okay. Collaboration, collaborate with. It's not only good for you as a clinician to be able to work with folks in other fields, but it actually makes the research better. Right? You may take a look at a research paper and think, oh, why'd they do that? That doesn't make any sense. But that's because you have a particular area of expertise that potentially the research didn't have and weren't able to account for that. So collaboration is key. Find resources. There are funds and grants that you can apply for to help build up or start a pilot project that you can then use as a springboard for a bigger project and more funding. It's important to establish a suitable environment. I will say that working here as an attending has been helpful, and I've had really good department chairs in psychiatry who've always sort of encourage their faculty to do more research, whichever shape, however form that may be. And it's also important to pay it forward. So not just mentorship for yourself, but serve as a mentor for others that are new to this, regardless of whether they're just starting as students or they're seasoned faculty who just want to see what this is like. So you want to pay it forward. And again, sort of breaking it down on an individual level. And I said mentorship is key, both on the individual level, and then openness to new ideas and collaborations, and then paying forward. These three, for me, I think are the most important recommendations, and institutionally. I know people come from different institutions. You need to build a framework that supports mentorship so that sort of simple mistakes in your proposal are caught on time, or you're aware of those things, so you're not spending 6 months working a proposal that the initial step is actually wrong. Right? That's a waste of someone's time and expertise, that if they'd gotten a mentor that would help them initially, that would have been avoided. And I think institutions should build a framework that supports this and provide resources, because we talk about research. You want us to do research, you need to provide the resources. And that could be something as simple as just as time, because that is a really big required resource to be able to do clinical research. Right. So I want to thank you all for taking time this afternoon to come with me on this journey. And for me, the plan is to continue moving forward. I'm going to say this, I am open to collaborating with folks at whichever institution and working with them and seeing if we can work together, if the question to be asked is something that interests me and is intriguing. And I want to be able to do that with my students, my residents, my fellows as well. All right. And again, thank you all for your attention. I'm going to stop share just now. Questions?
Can you talk about the wearable technology that you used for your research process?
All right, so when we first started with the pilot project, the engineers at UVA actually built the accelerometer. It was like a watch, and that was back in 2010. But by the time we started the Bessie project itself, the smartwatches had, they'd just gone, improved exponentially, that by the time that we're going to sort of decide which ones we're going to use, that we just picked an off-the-shelf smartwatch. It wasn't an Apple Watch or a Fitbit. Those were too expensive for the budget, but we used one. And I think that particular brand was acquired by Fitbit in the end. So that was the accelerometer we used for the person with dementia. The sensors that we use to measure light, humidity, acoustics, temperature, those were all built in-house by our engineering team.
Thank you.
Other questions for Dr. Bankole? So Dr. Bankole, I have to tell you a brief story, since there aren't any other questions. That I was chair of neurology when you were working with John Locke on this project, and John Locke and I would talk about this project, and I would say, John, why don't you use one of our neurology faculty here at UVA? And he would tell me there's this great geriatric psychiatrist who does clinical research at Carilion, and I'm loyal to partner with her. And I just today put that together. But that
wow.
So it's really nice to hear that story. I do want to highlight something that Dr. Bankole said that I think is really important, that not all of us probably recognize, but that I certainly feel, is that when you're a clinician and you're doing full-time clinical work on the inpatient wards, in the clinic, on call, and you're trying to create space to do consistent, high quality research, it is a very, very big lift. And I just want to congratulate you, Dr. Bankole, because you have done so much good quality investigator initiated clinical research, despite having a full plate of clinical work and then adding the administrative role. You are a role model for so many of us that want to stay in clinical research at the same time we do these other things. So I want to thank you for sharing all of that story and your successes.
Thank you so much for those kind words and for that story.
the world gets smaller, doesn't it? Yes.